Welcome, my friends, my fellow lovers of words, symbols, and stories. I'm genuinely happy you're here, because today we're not just watching a movie together. We're peeling back its layers like pages of a well-worn book. If you've stumbled across this corner of the internet, you're probably the kind of person who enjoys examining films the way one might examine a piece of literature. Carefully, curiously, with both head and heart engaged. And before we begin, let me kindly remind you, if you find these kinds of conversations nourishing, if you like wandering through movies as though they were novels filled with hidden margins of meaning, then do consider liking this video and subscribing. It really does help keep these explorations alive. Now, before we move forward, I need to be very clear. What you're about to hear is not a traditional movie review in the sense of star ratings, box office statistics, or recommendations for your Friday night watch list. No, this is something different. This is a theoretical and deeply critical reflection, almost like a long conversation over coffee with friends who enjoy parsing symbols, archetypes, and the ways popular stories reflect our collective imagination. This is education, this is insight, this is art meeting philosophy. And the film we'll be exploring together today is Jack the Giant Slayer, 2013. When I first saw this film, I didn't expect it to linger with me in the way it did. To be perfectly honest, I thought I was in for a simple retelling of a familiar fairy tale. I carried into it the same mild skepticism one often feels before opening a book that has been reprinted and reinterpreted countless times. You know the story, or at least you think you do. But what struck me immediately was the way this adaptation doesn't simply retell, it reframes. It asks us to think about storytelling itself, how myths survive, how legends evolve, and how human beings use narrative to negotiate fear, power, and destiny. And that, to me, is the kind of material that invites not just entertainment but meditation. So, what is this story about on the surface? We begin in a kingdom not unlike those we have encountered in folklore since childhood, where the boundaries between earth and sky, between mortal lives and mythic beings, are thin. A boy grows up on tales whispered to him in the camellit hush of bedtime. Giants who once roamed the skies, magic beings that serve as keys to other worlds, heroes who fight against impossible odds. These stories, passed down like heirlooms, shape him more than he realizes. When we fast forward to his young adulthood, we discover that the myth and the man are about to meet in ways he could never have foreseen. Now, here's something I find personally fascinating. The story wastes no time reminding us that myths are never just for children. They are codes. They are collective dreams passed from generation to generation, full of warnings and hopes. As a child, I remember being captivated by stories of magical objects, be they beans, rings, or enchanted swords, because they seemed to suggest that the extraordinary could be hidden in the ordinary, waiting only for the right hands to wield them. I think that's why this particular retelling resonated with me. It dares to take something as humble as a bean, a seed of potential, and turn it into a hinge on which entire worlds swing open. As the narrative unfolds, we meet a young farm boy who longs for something beyond the furrows of soil he tills. He's not exactly a dreamer in the cliched sense, but rather a seeker, someone who senses that the stories whispered to him long ago may have been more than bedtime comfort. Across the kingdom, meanwhile, a young princess faces her own struggle, caught between the responsibilities of royalty and the ache for freedom. Their paths cross not merely by chance, but by narrative necessity, because myths have a way of weaving characters together like threads of the same tapestry. And then comes the moment that sets everything in motion. The exchange of the beans. That transaction, so small, so seemingly inconsequential, becomes the turning point not only for the protagonist but for the world around him. The beans are spilled, literally, into the soil, and what grows is not just a stalk but a bridge between worlds. I remember the first time I saw that beanstalk unfurl on screen, twisting and writhing, reaching toward the heavens like some colossal metaphor for aspiration and danger. I felt a chill, because it reminded me of the myths of my own childhood, where climbing was always a metaphor, a ladder to heaven, a tower into the unknown, a quest upward that required both bravery and folly. And here's where the film becomes, in my eyes, a true literary text disguised as popcorn entertainment. For at its heart, The Beanstalk is not just a plot device, it's a symbol of transgression. It pierces the sky, daring to bridge the mortal with the monstrous, the earthly with the divine. Whenever humanity tries to climb too high, whether it be in Greek myths of Icarus or in the biblical tale of Babel, there's always a price. And yet, we climb anyway. That duality between aspiration and consequence is what gives this story its depth. I want to pause here and share something personal. When I was younger, I had this recurring dream that I was climbing a tree so massive that its branches vanished into the clouds. I'd keep climbing branch after branch, my heart racing, half exhilarated, half terrified. And just as I reached the edge of the sky, I would wake. Watching the beanstalk scene stirred that old memory back to life, as if the film had reached into some private corner of my subconscious. That's the magic of myth. It speaks to us in ways that feel deeply personal, even when the story belongs to everyone. Once the stalk connects Earth to the giant's realm, the story truly takes off. What lies above is not merely a fantastical land, but a distorted mirror of our own world, inhabited by creatures whose size exaggerates human vices, greed, violence, hunger. Giants in myth are rarely just big people. They are forces of nature, embodiments of excess. And here, they are rendered with all the grotesque exaggeration one would expect from beings meant to terrify and awe in equal measure. But what captivated me more than the spectacle of the giants was the way the narrative continually asks, what does it mean to be small? The farm boy is by every account ordinary. He has no noble birthright, no wealth, no obvious talents that mark him as a destined hero. And yet he climbs, and yet he resists, and yet he fights. It reminded me of those moments in life when we are confronted with tasks that feel larger than ourselves, when the obstacles tower, when the odds seem impossible, and yet something in us insists on moving forward. The plot, as it thickens, entwines not only the boy and the princess, but also courtiers, soldiers, and schemers. There is treachery, ambition, and betrayal, because humans, unlike giants, wield cunning as their great weapon. Without spoiling every turn, I'll say this. The story doesn't shy away from twisting its path in unexpected ways. Loyalties shift. Characters reveal layers of self-interest and fear. What seems at first to be a straightforward tale of boy versus monster grows into a meditation on power. Who seeks it, who abuses it, and who shoulders it reluctantly, but with honor. There's one particular twist that struck me deeply. When the line between hero and pawn blurs, when you realize that courage is often born not out of choice, but out of necessity. It's not that the boy wakes up one morning and says, I will be legendary. Rather, the world thrusts him into legend, and he either rises or he falls. That idea resonates with me personally because so many of life's pivotal moments arrive unannounced. We don't get to schedule our trials. They come like storms, and we are left to discover, sometimes painfully, who we really are. And so the story ascends and descends between worlds, pulling us along with it. There are battles and escapes, moments of humor and of heartbreak. But beneath it all lies a question that has haunted myth and literature for centuries. What does it mean to face something bigger than yourself? Do you shrink back, or do you climb? For me, the film isn't really about giants at all. It's about perspective. To a farmer's son, a giant is a monster. To the giant, a farmer is food. To a kingdom, both are symbols in the struggle for survival and sovereignty. And isn't that the way of all stories? We are each other's giants and each other's jacks, depending on where we stand. There's also, I think, something profoundly modern in the way this story treats its princess. She is not merely a prize to be won or a damsel to be saved. She's a figure who embodies the restlessness of anyone trapped by expectation. Her yearning for freedom mirrors the boy's yearning for greatness, and their journeys intertwine, not in cliché, but in shared recognition of what it means to resist the roles imposed upon us. As the climax approaches, without spoiling the specific turns, the story invites us to consider not just who triumphs, but why. Is heroism the result of skill, luck, birth, or is it simply the act of standing up again and again in the face of fear? I found myself asking these questions long after the credits rolled because they're the same questions we all confront, whether in quiet personal struggles or in moments of collective crisis. One of the things I admire most about this adaptation is how it threads humor into the tapestry without undermining its gravitas. The moments of levity feel like the sighs between heavy chapters, reminding us that even in the face of giants, humanity clings to wit, to laughter, to love. That, too, is a kind of resistance. By the end, the tale has shifted from a private adventure into a public myth. The boy who once listened to stories has now become a story himself, his deeds destined to be told and retold in the very cadence with which the film began. And that circularity, the way stories beget stories, is perhaps the most literary aspect of all. When I think about why this film matters to me, it's not because of its spectacle or even its particular interpretation of the fairy tale. It's because it reminds me that stories are alive. They grow and change, just like the beanstalk at their center. They sprout anew in each retelling, and each of us, as readers and viewers, waters them with our own experiences, our own dreams, our own fears. That is why myths endure, not because they are fixed, but because they are fertile. So, my dear friends, if you walk away from this reflection with anything, let it be this. Do not dismiss fairy tales as mere children's fodder. They are repositories of human longing, warnings etched in metaphor, blueprints of how we grapple with forces larger than ourselves. Whether those forces take the shape of giants or simply the trials of our everyday lives, the question remains the same. Will you climb? And perhaps in some quiet way, that is why I keep returning to this film. Not because it is flawless, no story ever is, but because it dares to remind us that within every ordinary person lies the possibility of legend. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. I hope you felt, as I did, that we were less watching a movie and more tracing the contours of a living myth together. If this journey resonated with you, if it stirred some memory or thought, please do consider liking this video and subscribing so we can continue these conversations. There are so many more stories waiting for us, more myths to climb, more giants to face. Until next time, may you find the courage to plant your own beans, to climb your own stalks, and to discover what waits in the clouds above. When the story begins, we find ourselves in that liminal space between bedtime tale and waking world, the threshold where myth meets memory. A boy sits wrapped before his father, hearing of battles long past, of towering enemies from the skies, of a kingdom once nearly undone by beings larger than life itself. And I don't know about you, but I've always been struck by those childhood moments when stories seep into us like ink in a parchment. We think we've left them behind, but then, years later, when life itself seems suddenly strange or daunting, those same words echo back. The opening of this film tapped into that feeling for me. The sense that stories whispered in childhood might not just be entertainment, but blueprints for the trials ahead. The father speaks of giants with a certain weight, as though even uttering their name gives them breath again. We see not only the boy's wide eyes, but also a young princess in another part of the kingdom, hearing the same legends from her own royal parent. Different stations in life, same stories, same shadows in the night. And that, to me, is already telling us something profound. Myth levels us. Whether we are farm-born or throne-born, we grow up under the same canopy of fear and wonder, the same cautionary tales meant to shape us. Time, as it does in stories, leaps forward, and suddenly that wide-eyed boy is a young man. He has grown, but he has not exactly grown into greatness. Instead, he tills soil, trades small things at the market, live a life most would call unremarkable. And yet the stories he once heard still hum inside him like a lone note of music. I find this deeply relatable. How many of us live outwardly simple lives while inwardly clutching to something invisible some myth, some sense. That we were meant for more. That gap between ordinary days and extraordinary dreams is where the story begins to breathe. It's in the market that threads begin to weave. A simple errand for his uncle, sell a horse, bring back coin, turns into something quite different. He encounters a monk, a man clearly rattled, carrying a pouch that he guards with almost sacred desperation. There's a chase, a scuffle, a sense of fate intervening. The monk thrusts the pouch into the boy's hand with the kind of intensity that suggests destiny is being transferred in that moment, though neither of them can yet see the full shape of it. And what's inside? Not jewels, not gold, but beans. Plain, unassuming beans. It's the kind of detail that always makes me smile. The world loves to hide its power in the smallest, humblest of vessels. A pebble that fells a giant, a ring that binds empires, a bean that cracks open the sky. My own grandmother used to tell me stories of magical seeds when I was small, and I remember staring at dried lentils in our kitchen jar, half convinced they might sprout something extraordinary if only I planted them at midnight. This moment in the story triggered that memory, and I felt the tug of childhood all over again. Of course, when he returns home, the exchange seems like folly. He was supposed to bring back money, not beans. His uncle scolds, dismisses, sighs with the weariness of someone who doesn't believe in dreams anymore. The pouch is set aside, and in that gesture, the tossing away of possibility, we glimpse one of the story's quiet truths. Miracles are often discarded before they're recognized. Meanwhile, across the kingdom, the young princess bristles under the expectations of court life. Betrothal, duty, royal appearances. These are her beans, so to speak, seed she never asked to carry. She slips away into disguise, wandering among her people, craving freedom, craving to know who she is when stripped of title. This parallel always strikes me as beautiful. The farm boy with his unwanted beans, the princess with her unwanted crown. Both of them bear symbols they did not choose, and both will have to decide what to do with them. Night falls, and the boy, caught between disappointment and resignation, stows the beans in a dark corner. Rain pounds against the roof. And then, a spill, a trickle of water. The bean rolls, lands in dampness. The soil drinks. And then, in one of the story's most unforgettable sequences, the earth convulses. A stalk erupts, not gently, but violently, as though the world itself is being pierced. I remember holding my breath as vines coiled upward, twisting into the night sky with unstoppable force. It felt less like a plant growing and more like destiny itself unfolding, unstoppable, terrifying, magnificent. The stalk doesn't just rise, it uproots. The boy's home is splintered, carried into the heavens, swallowed by green tendrils. And in that chaos, fate does what fate always does. It draws people together. The princess, caught in the storm of vines, is carried aloft. The boy, clinging for his life, finds himself staring upward at a stalk that seems to stretch forever into the clouds. This is where I find myself thinking of ancient stories. The Tower of Babel, where humans sought to bridge heaven and earth, or Jacob's ladder, where angels ascended and descended. To climb is to trespass, to dare to step beyond mortal boundaries. And here, the climb is not only literal but existential. Who among us has not looked at an impossible task and thought, can I ascend? Can I reach what seems unreachable? The kingdom rallies in panic. The king is told his daughter has been swept away. Men are gathered, not only soldiers, but also opportunists. Among them, a knight who embodies loyalty, and a scheming courtier whose ambition drips like poison. The boy, guilt heavy on his shoulders for having unwittingly unleashed this calamity, insists on joining them. And here I pause in my thoughts, because this moment felt achingly human to me. He is no warrior. He has no armor. But he has responsibility. And responsibility, more than courage, is often what sends ordinary people into extraordinary peril. The climb begins. Men scaling a living tower of vines, inch by inch, disappearing into mist. It's both breathtaking and ominous, the way the clouds seemed to swallow them whole. I couldn't help but recall my own experience years ago when I hiked a mountain trail and the summit was lost in fog. Every step upward was both exhilarating and terrifying because you never quite knew what awaited beyond the veil. That's what this scene evoked in me, the raw fear of the unknown, and yet the compulsion to keep moving upward. As they reach the summit, the world above reveals itself. Vast, alien, yet strangely familiar in its landscape. Rolling hills, forests, rivers. Nature untouched by human hands, yet infused with an uncanny largeness, as though everything here were scaled to remind mortals of their smallness. It is beautiful, yes, but also menacing because beauty in myth often hides teeth. The group presses on, seeking the princess. The boy keeps to the edges, watchful, tentative, carrying the dual burden of guilt and wonder. And then, inevitably, the giants appear. Not in full view at first, shadows, tremors, the sound of colossal movement in the distance. This is how fear works best, I think, hinted at, not yet revealed. I remembered sitting in my childhood bedroom at night, hearing footsteps in the hallway, never sure if it was my father returning late or something imagined. The anticipation is always worse than the reality. And in this story, the anticipation is drawn out until the giants finally step into the light. Their presence is grotesque and grand all at once. Larger than men, yet twisted, exaggerated, their features a mockery of human form. They embody appetite in its rawest sense, hunger for flesh, hunger for power. And here we realize the true danger. The giants are not just foes to be defeated, but forces that overwhelm, consume, obliterate. They are the embodiment of every fear that dwarfs us. The rescue mission splinters. Some are captured, some fall, some flee. Loyalties fracture under the weight of terror. The boy, against every expectation, begins to reveal something within himself. Not polished skill, not heroic bravado, but persistence, the stubborn refusal to give up. And this, to me, is the heart of myth. The heroes we remember are rarely the strongest. They're the ones who kept moving when others stopped. By the time the dust of these encounters settles, what began as a simple climb has become something much larger. The boy has seen the giants with his own eyes. The princess has, glimpsed what lies beyond the gilded walls of her upbringing. The king's men have realized that the old stories were not mere fables, but warnings. And the courtier with his dark ambitions has begun to see opportunity in disaster, a chance to wield giants as pawns rather than enemies. And so, as the clouds thicken and paths diverge, we stand with our characters at a crossroads. Some will cling to ambition, some will cling to fear, and some, against every odd, will cling to hope. That is where the story leaves us in this first great movement, suspended, as though we ourselves are dangling on the stalk, caught between earth and sky, unsure what will come next, but knowing, deep down, that the myths whispered to us as children have stepped into reality. When the clouds part and the enormity of the giant's world is revealed in full, something inside me shifts. Until now, the tale has been an upward climb, a slow revelation, a testing of boundaries. But once those great figures emerge from shadow and step firmly into the light, the story sharpens. The dreamlike haze of legend hardens into urgency, danger, consequence. This is no longer about bedtime tales or the thrill of climbing. This is about survival, betrayal, and the choices that decide whether kingdoms stand or fall. What fascinates me most here is how human ambition begins to take center stage. For all the enormity of the giants, their size, their cruelty, their hunger, it is not they alone who threaten the fragile peace of the kingdom. No, it is the greed of men that begins to weave catastrophe. I've always found this pattern hauntingly true to life. My grandfather used to say that the giants outside are never as dangerous as the giants inside, meaning fear, envy, pride. As the story unfolds, I see that wisdom reflected in every treacherous glance, every grasp for power disguised as loyalty. Among the king's men, One figure in particular makes his intentions clear. While others tremble at the giants, he schemes to bend them to his will. His plan centers on an artifact of immense symbolic weight, a crown forged long ago, said to grant dominion over the giants to whomever wears it. When he sets his eyes on it, I felt a chill, not because I feared for the boy or the princess in that moment, but because I recognized the archetype, the tyrant in waiting, the man who believes power exists only to be taken. He is not unlike Macbeth gazing upon the crown of Scotland, or Milton's Lucifer whispering better to reign in hell. Stories teach us over and over. It is not the monsters who undo us, but our own thirst for mastery. Meanwhile, our young farm boy continues to stumble forward, every step a surprise, even to himself. What I admire most about him is his refusal to accept the script written for him. At any moment, he could retreat, declare himself too small, too unskilled, too ordinary. And yet he stays, driven partly by guilt, partly by hope, and partly by that mysterious current of fate that sweeps the unlikeliest souls into legend. It reminds me of times in my own life when I found myself in situations I felt utterly unqualified for, jobs I didn't think I could handle, crises I didn't think I could weather. And yet somehow, stumbling, fumbling, I endured. That's what I see in him. Not a polished hero, but an everyman who keeps putting one foot forward, even when trembling. The princess, too, emerges here not as a prize, but as a partner in the struggle. I cherish this aspect of the story. She is not written as a delicate figure waiting for rescue, but as someone who insists on carving her own path. She resists captivity, fights when she must, and even when the giant's shadows loom over her, her spirit does not yield. Watching her reminded me of the women in myths who defy the roles pressed upon them. Atalanta racing against suitors, Antigone defying her king. She is heir to that lineage of fierce resistance. And yet, as their paths entwine further, the tension between them and the scheming courtier grows. He secures the crown, wields it, and for a brief, dreadful span, the giants bend to his will. It is one of the film's boldest turns. Instead of a straightforward battle of men against monsters, it becomes a battle of men using monsters, weaponizing them for conquest. When I first saw this, I felt a pang of recognition. Isn't this what history teaches us again and again? That power lies not merely in strength, but in manipulation? That armies are bent not by loyalty, but by symbols, crowns, flags, relics? With the crown gleaming on his head, the traitor orders the giants to descend upon the kingdom. That moment struck me as both thrilling and tragic. The boy and princess struggle desperately to intervene, but the tide has shifted. The stalk itself becomes a contested ground. Men climbing down in panic, giants forcing their way through, a green artery now pumping chaos between worlds. The descent is as perilous as the ascent ever was. And here I thought of a truth I've often felt in life. It is harder to climb down than to climb up. The return, the undoing, the reckoning. Those are the hardest steps of any journey. The boy clings, scrambles, fights. His courage is not graceful, but raw. There's a moment where he nearly falls, caught by sheer luck, saved by sheer grit. And I remember gripping the armrest in the theater, thinking of all the times I myself felt I was dangling by a thread in life, barely holding on. Isn't that what it means to be human? We don't glide through trials like storybook heroes. We scrape and claw and clutch, and sometimes that is enough. Below, the kingdom braces. Alarm sound. Citizens scatter. The king marshals his forces. But what good are men with swords against giants bearing down from the sky? The clash, when it comes, is thunderous. Towers shatter. Gates quake. Men scatter like ants before a flood. The giants descend upon the city, not merely as invaders, but as the return of an old nightmare long dismissed as myth. I thought of Troy under siege, of Jerusalem beset, of any city in history that has looked up to see the enemy at its gates and known the end might be near. And yet, even here, hope flickers. The boy, driven now less by guilt than by resolve, finds himself face to face with choices he never imagined. He seizes small opportunities, moments to distract, to outwit, to resist. He is no warrior, but he is clever. He learns that giants, for all their might, are clumsy, overconfident, and vulnerable to their own appetites. His triumphs are not in slaying, but in surviving, in thinking differently. This resonates with me deeply. My victories in life have never been grand or cinematic. They've been quiet, small, moments where persistence outlasted pressure. That's what I see in him. Victory not of might, but of stubbornness. The traitor's ambition, however, cannot be sustained. His grip on power falters. In one of the most satisfying turns, the very crown he sought becomes the weight that drags him down. Giants obey symbols, yes, but they also sense weakness, fear, deceit. The crown falls into new hands, and for a moment, chaos reigns. Giants rage not as an army, but as beasts unchained, their hunger turning them against each other as much as against men. The boy seizes this moment. He doesn't try to command, he tries to end the cycle. His ingenuity shines in how he uses the world around him, not brute force, to topple what seems untoppable. I won't spoil every precise detail, but I will say this. His triumph is not just physical, but symbolic. He proves that cleverness and integrity can achieve what greed and violence cannot. It reminded me of David against Goliath, not just because of the obvious size difference, but because of the manner of victory, faith in something beyond raw power. And when at last the stalk is felled, crashing back into the earth, there is a silence that feels almost holy. The sky closes. The giants are cut off once more. The kingdom breathes again. But something fundamental has shifted. Myths are no longer just bedtime stories. They are blood-soaked truths etched into memory. The boy is no longer just a farmhand. He is a figure who has crossed from obscurity into legend. What lingers most with me is not the battle, but the aftermath. The way the people begin to tell the story, embellishing here, omitting there. The way the boy and the princess share a glance that suggests both relief and recognition. That they have seen each other not as archetypes, but as humans, tested and tempered. The way the crown, once a symbol of tyranny, is locked away, a reminder that power unchecked is a danger greater than any giant. And then, in a tender echo of the story's beginning, we return to the voice of storytelling itself. A child, once again, hearing of giants, of beings, of a boy who climbed. But now the tale is richer, layered with the dust of real sacrifice and the shimmer of hope. It struck me deeply in that moment that this is how myths are born, not in the events themselves, but in the telling afterward. What survives is not the exact truth, but the essence, the lesson, the shape of the story as it is carried forward. I thought of the stories I was told as a child, how they shifted depending on who told them, how my grandmother's versions differed from my father's. Myths are living things, altered by each tongue, reshaped by each era. And here, the cycle continues. The boy who once heard of giants has now become the giant of another story. That circularity left me with a quiet smile, a reminder that we are all part of an endless chain of telling and retelling. By the time the final notes fade, the feeling is not just of closure, but of continuity. The kingdom is safe, yes, but more importantly, the myth has been renewed. And I think that is the deepest truth this tale offers, that stories never end. They climb, like beanstalks, ever upward, branching into the clouds, waiting for new dreamers to climb after them. And so, as I sit here recalling it all, I realize that what makes this story powerful to me is not its battles or its spectacle, but its insistence that even the smallest of us, armed with persistence, integrity, and imagination, can shape the myths that others will one day tell. That is not just a fairy tale lesson. That is life. What lingers most after the tale is not only the rise and fall of kingdoms, nor the thunder of giants toppling to earth, but the faces that carried us through it. Stories live or die by their characters, because characters are the mirrors we hold up to ourselves. And in this particular myth reborn on screen, every figure, whether humble, regal, or monstrous, reveals something about human longing, frailty, and strength. The farm boy, for instance, remains at the heart of it all. On paper, he is archetypal, the orphaned or near-orphaned youth, the dreamer with no resources, the one overlooked by his world. But what fascinates me is how his ordinariness is emphasized again and again. He is not chosen by prophecy, nor anointed by kings, nor gifted with supernatural talent. He is clumsy, he hesitates, he doubts. And yet, precisely because of this ordinariness, he becomes the most accessible figure. He is us. When he first fumbles with the beans, or when he clings in terror to the stalk, I see myself, hesitant, uncertain, wishing someone else were better equipped. And here lies the paradox that makes him compelling. He is not heroic because he believes himself capable, but because he keeps moving despite believing otherwise. This, to me, is the essence of resilience. I remember once being thrust into a job that felt impossibly beyond me. Every day, I went home convinced I would fail. Yet I kept showing up, stumbling through tasks, gradually discovering that persistence itself breeds competence. The farm boy mirrors that truth. Not a shining knight, but a figure who survives by refusing to give up. That is a kind of courage literature has long celebrated. From Odysseus enduring storms to Pip stumbling through shame and great expectations. His relationship with the princess reveals another layer of his character. He is not dazzled by her crown, nor deferential to her status. Instead, he sees in her a fellow soul restless for more than the roles assigned them. This mutual recognition, this refusal to reduce her to an object of rescue, marks him not only as a decent man, but as a character capable of growth. I admire how his affection for her arises not from her beauty alone, but from her defiance, her yearning for freedom. In that, he is unlike so many heroes of old, whose motives hinge on conquest or reward. He instead respects her agency. That makes his journey not a pursuit of possession, but a partnership in resilience. The princess herself is perhaps my favorite character. From the earliest scenes, we sense her chafing against the silken shackles of royalty. She is not written as a rebellious caricature, but as a woman genuinely torn between duty and desire. Her father's expectations, her arranged betrothal, her gilded confinement, all weigh heavily, and yet she pushes against them with quiet strength. I see in her echoes of so many literary heroines, Jane Eyre insisting on dignity, Antigone refusing to yield to unjust law, even Elizabeth Bennet pushing against the constraints of her society. Each of them embodies resistance, not for the sake of defiance alone, but because something inside whispers, I am more than the role you've written for me. What strikes me personally about her is the balance she maintains between vulnerability and resolve. She is not written as invincible, nor should she be. There are moments when fear crosses her face, when uncertainty trembles in her voice. But those moments do not diminish her. They humanize her. They remind us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. When she climbs, when she resists captivity, when she defies her captors, she embodies that truth. I remember once standing at a crossroads in my own life, leaving behind the security of a path I was told I should take in order to pursue what my heart knew was right. I was terrified, but I went anyway. Watching her, I felt that memory rise again, as if her story was whispering back. Yes, this is what courage looks like. The king, her father, is another figure worth pausing on. He is at once sympathetic and frustrating. Sympathetic because he is a man who loves his daughter and fears for his kingdom. Frustrating because his love manifests in control, in arranging her future without her consent, in viewing her as both child and symbol rather than full human being. I've always found kings and stories fascinating because they embody the paradox of power. They rule others, yet they themselves are ruled by fear. Fear of losing their crown, their lineage, their legacy. This king is no different. He is stern, honorable, but deeply bound by tradition. And in that, he reflects so many parents, mine included, who acted out of love but try to shape me according to their own vision rather than trusting mine. His arc is quiet, but meaningful, He must learn that love is not possession, that authority must sometimes yield to trust. And then there is the traitor, the ambitious courtier who covets the crown that can control giants. He is, in many ways, the story's true villain, more insidious than any towering brute. Giants destroy by nature, but he destroys by choice. That distinction is vital. His hunger for power eclipses his loyalty, his morality, even his survival instinct. What makes him so compelling is that he is not an aberration, but an amplification of a very human flaw, ambition unmoored from ethics. In literature, such figures recur endlessly: Macbeth, Iago, Edmund, and King Lear. Each reminds us that the darkest monsters are not the ones outside the gates, but the ones inside our own courts, our own hearts. I confess, I find his character uncomfortably relatable. Not because I've ever seized crowns or commanded armies, of course, but because I know the whisper of ambition, that temptation to take shortcuts, to grasp at symbols of success without earning the substance beneath them. Watching his fall, I was reminded of moments in my own past when ambition nearly blinded me to compassion. Stories like this serve as mirrors, cautioning us against paths we might easily tread ourselves. The knight, by contrast, embodies loyalty. He is steady, brave, a man of honor, even when the ground shifts beneath him. At times, he risks fading into archetype, the faithful retainer. But what redeems him is his humanity. He is not blind in his loyalty. He questions, he grieves, he doubts. And that doubt makes his loyalty meaningful, because it is chosen, not imposed. He reminded me of Samwise in The Lord of the Rings, or Kent in King Lear. Those figures who carry the weight of others' destinies on their shoulders, not because they seek glory, but because they cannot bear to abandon those they love. And then, of course, we must speak of the giants themselves. On one level, they are grotesque caricatures, massive, ravenous embodiments of hunger and cruelty. But on another level, they function as symbols. They are the forces of excess, of appetite unbounded. They're not individuals so much as embodiments of what happens when power is unchecked. Their leader, fierce and cunning, exudes a menace that is more than physical. It is strategic. He is not a mindless beast, but a calculating commander, which makes him doubly dangerous. I've often thought of giants and myths as projections of our fears. We make them large because our anxieties feel large. In childhood, I imagined shadows in my room as giants, looming, towering, inescapable. Watching them here, I felt that same childhood unease. But what the story ultimately suggests is that giants, no matter how frightening, can be overcome. And that, I think, is why we tell stories of them at all. To remind ourselves that fear, no matter how immense, is not invincible. If the boy is the heart of the story and the princess its spirit, then the giants are its shadow. They make the light visible by contrast. They remind us that heroism only matters in the presence of terror. Without them, the boy's courage would mean little. The princess's defiance would feel trivial. They are the crucible in which character is tested. What fascinates me further is how each of these figures interacts, not only with the plot, but with one another. The boy and the princess mirror each other's yearning for more. The king and the traitor embody two faces of power, one rooted in tradition, the other in ambition. The knight and the giants form opposites, loyalty versus excess, duty versus appetite. Together, they create a spectrum of human experience, from nobility to corruption, from humility to arrogance. And when the story ends, what stays with me is not a single character alone, but the interplay of all of them. It is the way the boy's ordinariness meets the princess's fire, the way the king's control collides with the traitor's scheming, the way the giant's enormity dwarfs the humans, and yet reveals their inner enormity of will. Characters are never islands. They are mirrors for one another, shaping, testing, and refining each other until the story resolves. I often think about how, in our own lives, we play these roles for each other. Sometimes we are the loyal knight, steadying a friend in need. Sometimes we are the restless princess, aching to break free. Sometimes, if we're honest, we're the ambitious trader tempted by shortcuts. And sometimes we're the farm boy, unsure, stumbling, but moving forward anyway. That is why this story lingers with me. Not because of its spectacle, but because in each character, I see fragments of myself. And perhaps that is the true gift of character in storytelling. They're not just figures on a screen or names on a page. They're lenses, prisms through which we see ourselves more clearly. They whisper back to us the truths we already know but often forget. That courage is persistence, that love is respect, that power is peril, that giants can be felled. When the lights dimmed that first evening I sat down to watch the film, I thought I was entering only into the world of the fairy tale, made new. What I did not realize, what none of us realize, really, until we begin to peel back the layers, is that films themselves carry secret histories, shadow stories unfolding behind the camera, even as the actors speak their lines. Every movie has two lives, the one projected before us, and the one lived in whispers on the set, intense production meetings, in rewrites scrawled at midnight. And this story, for all its giants and kingdoms, has its own collection of strange truths that, to me, make it even more fascinating. The first thing that struck me when I began to learn more was just how long the journey to bring this tale to life actually was. Scripts had circulated for years, draft after draft passed through. Different hands like a manuscript, no one quite knew how to finish. Some writers leaned into comedy, some into dark fantasy, others into sweeping romance. It reminds me of how myths themselves evolve. Every storyteller adds a new layer, reshapes an old motif, stitches their own anxieties and desires into the cloth. And in this case, what we see on screen is not the work of a single hand, but the palimpsest of many, a patchwork quilt of visions. I find something beautiful in that, almost literary. It is like opening a medieval text and seeing the fingerprints of scribes across centuries. What fascinates me further is the way production nearly collapsed at several points. Budgets ballooned, release dates shifted, nervous executives hovered like storm clouds. At one stage, the film was delayed almost an entire year, re-edited and rescored, as though the studio itself were climbing its own impossible beanstalk, uncertain if the clouds above hid treasure or ruin. I think about that sometimes. How much of life is like that delay, a pause we never asked for, a season of waiting where the story seems suspended. We think we're climbing toward clarity, only to find ourselves stuck in fog, asked to wait a little longer. One of the strangest and most human details is how much of the actors' work took place in a void. The giants, as we see them, were conjured largely through motion capture, long after filming had wrapped. This meant that in many of the most intense scenes, battles, confrontations, moments of supposed terror, the cast stood in front of empty space or tennis balls on sticks, told to imagine creatures 20 feet tall looming over them. I try to picture that, to scream in terror at nothing, to slash a sword through the air and pretend it struck flesh that did not exist yet. It makes me chuckle, but also fills me with admiration. Acting, in such circumstances, is not simply performance, but faith, the conviction that your imagination will one day be filled in by invisible artists behind computers. The process of creating the giants themselves was bizarre in its own right. The actors playing them had to wear strange suits covered in sensors, every twitch and snarl captured, their faces mapped and then grotesquely magnified in digital form. Some of the actors admitted later that they felt foolish at times, leaping and roaring in skin-tight suits while crew members watched. And yet, isn't that what art so often demands of us? To risk looking absurd in the hope that something transcendent will emerge. I think of poets reading drafts aloud to empty rooms, dancers rehearsing alone before a mirror, painters dabbing at canvases no one will see for months. Foolishness is often the birthplace of beauty. Another detail that lingers with me is how the weather itself seemed to conspire against the production. In several outdoor scenes, unexpected storms rolled in, delaying filming, soaking elaborate costumes, threatening to topple set pieces. There are stories of massive tarps hurriedly thrown over entire areas, of actors shivering in sodden clothes while waiting for skies to clear. To me, this almost feels mythic, nature itself refusing to yield easily to the retelling of its own old stories. After all, the beanstalk is an affront to nature, a plant grown too large, too fast, piercing the sky itself. Perhaps the storms were nature's protest, a reminder that stories are not conjured without resistance. What's even stranger is that the beanstalk we see was, in many cases, physical. Yes, computer effects were used for the great sweeping shots, but for close-ups, massive sections of vine were built by hand, tangled coils of wood and resin, painted to mimic bark and leaves, so the actors could cling and scramble. Some of those pieces weighed tons. I love this detail because it shows the collision of craft and illusion. Carpenters and set designers sweating for months so that, for a fleeting moment on screen, we might believe in magic. It reminds me of the medieval cathedrals, where masons carved gargoyles no one would ever notice from the ground. Labor offered in faith, unseen but essential. Then there are the little accidents, those small mishaps that seem minor but ripple into the final product. In one scene, a horse apparently refused to cooperate, rearing and pulling against its handler so violently that the take was nearly abandoned. Yet later, watching the footage, the director chose to keep it in, deciding the chaos lent authenticity to the moment. It makes me smile, because isn't life itself like that? Our most unscripted stumbles, our moments of loss of control, are often what make the story more alive. The casting itself carries its own oddities. Several major stars were approached for roles, but declined, fearing the script was too strange, too risky. And yet those absences shaped the film's tone. I often wonder what might have been had one of those more famous names agreed. But in truth, I think the choices made gave the story a kind of freshness. There's something freeing about not being weighed down by celebrity personas. The boy feels like a boy, not a superstar. The princess feels like a young woman caught between worlds, not an actress playing dress-up. Sometimes absence is its own strange blessing. Even stranger, perhaps, is how the film was received. Critics were divided, audiences uncertain. Some dismissed it as overblown, others praised its earnestness. It did not conquer the box office, though it cost a fortune to make. And yet, years later, here we are, still talking about it, still analyzing it, still plumbing its depths for meaning. That, to me, is one of the strangest facts of all, that a film considered a stumble by some becomes, for others, a source of fascination, even love. It reminds me of books once dismissed as failures that later became classics. Time reshapes value. Perhaps that is the real magic bean. One quirky anecdote I can't help but share involves the recording of the giants' voices. To create their booming sound, engineers experimented with layering multiple actors' lines, blending them with slowed-down animal roars and even the groaning of industrial machinery. The result was eerie, uncanny, not quite human. Imagine standing in a studio, roaring like a beast while someone records you, knowing that your growl will be stitched into a monster's throat. I laughed when I read that because it feels like the kind of detail we'd never guess watching the final film. Behind the majesty of giants is the absurdity of microphones and soundboards. Then there's the curious story of the beans themselves. For close-up shots, real beans were used, painted with shimmering lacquer to look otherworldly. But in some early test screenings, audiences laughed, saying the beans looked too plain, too much like something from a grocery store. As a result, digital artists added tiny flecks of glowing light, making them shimmer faintly. To me, this tiny adjustment says so much about storytelling. We crave wonder even in the smallest props. We cannot accept the ordinary unless it hums faintly with mystery. I also love the strangeness of how the giants' costumes, though largely digital, were inspired by medieval manuscripts. Designers pored over old drawings of giants, grotesques, and monsters from illuminated texts, using those exaggerated proportions to shape the look. The result is a lineage that stretches backward in time, What we see on screen is not just modern fantasy, but the resurrection of medieval imagination. When I learned this, I felt a jolt of delight, as though the film were in secret conversation with centuries of storytellers before it. And then there is the crown. The prop itself was forged in gleaming metal, heavy and elaborate, though in many shots it was replaced digitally. But the weight of the real crown was so much that actors complained of neck strain after wearing it for long takes. That detail struck me as ironic, power literally weighing them down. It is almost too perfect, a metaphor written into the bones of the production itself. There's even a peculiar note about food. During scenes where giants are shown feasting, massive fake meat and bread were constructed, grotesque replicas several feet across. But when those didn't look convincing enough, digital artists added subtle details. Grease, crumbs, the faint sheen of saliva. The result is grotesque, but believable. I find that unsettling and fascinating, that someone, somewhere, spent weeks perfecting the glisten of giant spit on a digital drumstick. It is the kind of obsessive detail that reveals the strangeness of filmmaking. And through it all, what I keep returning to is this. The story of the film's making is itself a kind of fairy tale. A kingdom of artists and technicians struggling against delays, storms, failures, betrayals of budget and ambition. Giants in this case were not only on the screen, but in the boardrooms, in the towering demands of technology, in the monstrous appetites of studios hungry for success. And yet, somehow, against all odds, the film exists. Imperfect, flawed, but alive. That, perhaps, is the strangest fact of all. That art, fragile as it is, survives the giants of its own making. Scripts lost, storms raging, actors roaring into voids, critics frowning. Yet the story still climbed into the clouds and planted itself in our imaginations. And here we are, years later, still tracing its leaves, still marveling at the oddities hidden in its growth. When I think of it now, I see the film less as a finished product and more as a living stock of contradictions. It is at once earnest and absurd, ambitious and clumsy, cherished and dismissed. It was born of mishaps, nourished by countless hands, battered by storms, and yet it grew. Perhaps it is why it resonates with me so deeply. Because aren't we all, in some way, films like this strange, stitched together, misunderstood, and yet still climbing, still telling our stories despite the odds? When I think back on the film, what lingers with me is not just the spectacle of the giants or the daring of the battles, but the way certain events unfold with a rhythm that feels at once ancient and newly urgent. The story, for all its surface of fantasy, invites us to think about power, about courage, about the fragile line between myth and lived reality. And so, when I revisit it now, what I find myself doing is not merely summarizing, but lingering, hovering over moments, pausing to turn them in the light like strange stones, examining the patterns hidden in their grain. One of the earliest significant events that comes to mind is the planting of the bean. It seems simple enough, a boy with a handful of strange seeds, a storm, a careless slip, and yet this moment resonates with all the weight of myth. From a critical perspective, it's fascinating because it marks the collision between the ordinary and the extraordinary. The seed is small, humble, almost laughable in its insignificance. But in its germination lies catastrophe, adventure, destiny. I cannot help but think of it as an emblem of storytelling itself. The smallest detail, the tiniest gesture, can sprout into a narrative that overwhelms kingdoms. What makes it powerful is not just the spectacle of the beanstalk's rise, though that alone is unforgettable. The spiraling tower of green tearing through earth and sky, but the way it captures the vulnerability of human life. One careless act can summon forces beyond imagining. I remember watching that sequence with a strange tightness in my chest. The boy's panic, the princess swept away, the vine thrusting itself upward like a living hunger. It made me think of how stories so often begin not with grand choices, but with accidents. Critical readers might call this an invocation of fate, or perhaps the cruelty of chance. but for me, it feels closer to the truth of our lives. How often do we find ourselves pulled into narratives we did not choose, swept upward by vines we never intended to plant? That, to me, is the genius of this event. It offers us both awe and recognition. From there, another pivotal event is the gathering of the rescue party. Here, the narrative shifts gears. What was once a domestic mishap becomes a matter of state. The princess is missing. The king's men assemble. And suddenly a small farm boy is thrust into company far above his station. From a critical lens, this moment functions as the film's assertion of hierarchy and its challenge to it. The knights represent tradition, authority, and sanctioned strength, while the boy represents accident, improvisation, and the unpredictable spark of the commoner. When they climb together, rope in hand, scaling that impossible vine, what we see is not just a physical ascent, but a metaphorical one. The bridging of classes, the temporary collapse of the gulf between palace and hut. I recall feeling strangely moved by that climb. There was a quietness to it, punctuated by nervous glances, grunts of exertion, the creak of rope. Critics might frame it as a moment of foreshadowing, the literal ascent toward a realm of gods and monsters. But for me, it was also a reminder of how stories demand companions. No hero climbs alone, no matter how central their role may appear. And so, the vine becomes not only a bridge between worlds, but between people, binding together lives that otherwise would never have touched. Once the characters breach the clouds and find themselves in the realm above, the film takes on a darker tone. The giant's world is grotesque, unsettling, marked by decay and excess. One event in particular stands out to me: the discovery of the giants' crude dwelling spaces, their fires smoldering, their bones scattered, their feasts grotesquely half-finished. From a critical perspective, this imagery taps into the Gothic tradition. The giants are less creatures of wonder than embodiments of appetite unchecked, civilization gone rancid. Their world is a parody of our own, stripped of refinement and reduced to hunger. Watching it, I found myself thinking of myths where gods mirror human vices, drunkenness, greed, cruelty, and how those tales often serve as warnings. Here, too, the giants stand as warnings, their very existence forcing us to ask, what happens when power has no boundary? When desire devours restraint? The kidnapping of the princess by the giants and the subsequent terror she faces is another event layered with critical potential. On one level, it is the classic damsel in distress trope, and modern critics have rightly examined the gender dynamics at play. But what strikes me is how the film complicates that trope, showing her not merely as a passive victim, but as a figure who resists, who schemes, who watches for openings. Her captivity becomes not only a trial for the rescuers, but a crucible for her own agency. I remember the look in her eyes, fear, yes, but also defiance, and I thought of how many stories we inherit where women are silenced, their struggles invisible. This moment, for all its conventional trappings, seemed to whisper against that silence, offering her resistance as part of the tale's heartbeat. Then, there is the betrayal within the rescue party, a turn that always strikes me as both inevitable and devastating. A man entrusted with the mission reveals his true loyalties, siding with the giants for the promise of power. Critics might frame this as a commentary on ambition, on the corruptibility of human beings when faced with temptation. And truly, it resonates with literary echoes. The Judas figure, the Brutus figure, the ever-present shadow of betrayal in heroic narratives. But what touched me most was how it reframed the boy's role. Until then, he had been largely reactive, swept along by forces larger than himself. Betrayal forces him to step forward, to recognize that courage cannot be outsourced to those older, stronger, or more experienced. This, for me, was one of the film's quiet triumphs. The way it used treachery not only to advance the plot, but to ignite the boy's transformation. The great battle sequences that follow, humans against giants, fragile weapons against monstrous strength, invite their own kind of critical reflection. Spectacle Yes, but also allegory. I remember the pounding of drums, the clash of iron, the cries echoing across fields. Critics sometimes dismiss such scenes as indulgent, but I think they serve a deeper function. They remind us of the asymmetry of our own struggles. We are always, in some way, the small against the vast, the fragile against the monstrous. Watching knights scatter before a charging giant, I thought of how life so often feels like that. Our ambitions dwarfed, our fears towering. Yet the story insists that even here, in this imbalance, resistance matters. A thrown spear, a shouted command, a boy's cleverness. These gestures are not nothing. They ripple. They matter. One of the most significant turns, and perhaps my favorite, is the revelation of the crown's power. Here we see the deepest merging of myth and politics, magic and authority. The crown does not merely adorn, it commands. Whoever wears a hold sway over the giants themselves. Critics might read this as a meditation on symbols, on the way objects become imbued with cultural and psychological force. To me, it felt almost Shakespearean. The crown is at once salvation and curse, a tool that can unify or destroy. I remember the hush I felt when its power was revealed, not just excitement at the twist, but something heavier. A recognition of how dangerous it is to bind so much authority to a single symbol. The crown tames giants, yes, but who tames the wearer of the crown? That is the question that lingers. The climax, with armies clashing and the fate of kingdoms trembling, carries the weight of inevitability. But what I cherish most is not the thunder of battle, but the moments of stillness inside it. The look exchanged between the boy and the princess, the silent realization of the king watching his people, the flicker of doubt in the betrayer's eyes before his fall. Critics sometimes focus on a bombast, but I find myself drawn to these quieter notes. They're the soul beneath the armor, the heartbeat beneath the roar. Without them, the battle would be empty spectacle. With them, it becomes something closer to tragedy and triumph intertwined. And then, of course, there is the resolution. The fall of the giants, the restoration of order, the return to earth. Critics might argue about whether it ties things too neatly, whether the giant's menace is too easily dismissed. But I confess, I felt a certain relief, a release of tension. Perhaps that is the point. Fairy tales, however modernized, promise us a return to safety. The vine is cut, the portal closed, the danger sealed away. Yet even as I watched the boy and princess walk into their new future, I could not help but feel a pang. For though the giants are gone, the memory of their hunger lingers. And perhaps that is what the story means to leave with us. That we may close the door on danger, but we cannot unlearn its shadow. In thinking critically about these events, what I find most striking is how they echo across time and genre. The planting of the bean, the climb, the betrayal, the crown, these are not isolated inventions but archetypes, recurring shapes in the fabric of story. They resonate because they touch something deep in us, something we recognize even if we cannot name it. That, I think, is why the film endures despite its flaws. It taps into that ancient rhythm, even as it dresses it in modern spectacle. And on a personal level, I think of how these events mirror our own lives. We plant seeds carelessly and watch them grow into consequences we never imagined. We climb ropes into strange skies, pulled into adventures beyond our strength. We meet betrayal, we fight giants, we discover crowns heavy with power we are not sure we want. And if we are lucky, we return to Earth wiser, scarred, and yet still alive. That, to me, is the film's true critical gift. Not merely that it entertains, but that it offers us a mirror, distorted, fantastical, but still reflecting something of who we are. When I look back now, years after first seeing it, I find myself grateful for its events, for their strangeness and their resonance. For though giants may fade and crowns may tarnish, the story itself climbs on, like that endless vine, still reaching toward our imaginations, still reminding us of the wonder and terror of being human. When I look back at this film, I don't only remember the story told on the screen. I also remember the whispers of its creation. The way cinema so often feels like a second narrative layer beneath the first, a hidden tale of sweat and sparks and strange accidents. Watching the final product is one experience, but pulling back the curtain and glimpsing the production is another story entirely. Sometimes more human, sometimes more fascinating than the fantasy itself. And that, to me, is where so much of the magic resides. The making of this particular film was no simple feat. It had been whispered about for years before it finally appeared on screen, passed between directors, rewritten by different hands, delayed by budgets and visions that refused to align. I often think of it like the beanstalk at the center of the tale. It didn't just spring up overnight. It had to be planted, nurtured, argued over, shaped. Each draft of the script was another tendril, twisting in its own direction. Each creative voice that touched it left a mark, whether subtle or glaring. By the time the film finally emerged, it carried within it the fingerprints of many dreamers and worriers alike. One of the first fascinating details I learned was how the project had originally been envisioned much earlier than its release date, with multiple drafts floating through Hollywood for years. Screenwriters came and went. Some versions leaned heavily into horror, imagining the giants as grotesque nightmares meant to terrify audiences. Others played with comedy, exaggerating the absurdity of men fighting monsters with nothing but farm tools and courage. What eventually emerged was a kind of middle ground, still frightening, but tempered with wonder, still whimsical, but carrying the weight of an epic. I often wonder what it would have been like if those earlier drafts had survived, but perhaps that is the nature of cinema. We receive not the purest vision, but the one that survives the many negotiations between imagination and industry. When filming began, one of the biggest challenges was, of course, the giants themselves. In an age where audiences had grown accustomed to seamless computer-generated worlds, there was enormous pressure to make these towering figures believable. The production leaned into performance capture technology, allowing actors to embody the giants with all their quirks, gestures, and menacing weight. This wasn't just a matter of technical convenience. It was a creative choice that brought an uncanny realism to their movements. I remember reading about the actors who played these digital titans, how they wore strange suits dotted with reflective markers, how they stomped across sound stages surrounded by green screens and cameras, their every twitch captured. It strikes me as oddly poetic, this idea of human actors pretending to be monsters so that machines could later transform them into something larger than life. It's a reminder that beneath the pixels, there's always flesh, beneath the fantasy, always reality. And the actors who took on these roles weren't simply hired for their voices. They studied movement, they exaggerated postures, they tried to think as beings whose height dwarfed mountains. There's something beautifully absurd about that image. Grown adults lurching around a studio, mimicking the lumbering gait of creatures that don't exist, and yet believing in them enough to give them life. Another detail I found endlessly fascinating was the sheer scale of the sets. Even in an era of digital trickery, the filmmakers wanted tangible, tactile environments. The beanstalk itself was partially built, sections of vine twisting through sound stages, enormous leaves crafted by hand, each one big enough for a grown man to lie on. Actors could grab onto them, feel their texture, smeared dirt across their hands as though they were truly climbing something alive. I imagine the crew working late into the night, constructing this impossible ladder out of foam and wood, stitching fantasy into fabric and plastic. There's something deeply human about that effort, the desire to make magic real, even for just a moment. And then, of course, there are the fun accidents that always accompany big productions. I once heard that during filming, some of the sets became so humid and warm under the lights that condensation formed on the massive artificial leaves, dripping down like real dew. The crew laughed at the irony, the set itself behaving as though it were alive, as though the beanstalk had truly taken root. Another anecdote involved the costumes. The heavy armor worn by the king's men was so cumbersome that extras would sometimes faint during long shoots. To lighten the mood, One of the lead actors reportedly began cracking jokes about being defeated by the wardrobe department before even facing a giant, and it became a running gag on set. The blending of practical sets and digital worlds required extraordinary patience. Entire sequences had to be shot multiple times, once with real actors, once with stand-ins for giants, and sometimes again with nothing at all, just empty air where a digital monster would later be placed. I imagine the actors standing on a windswept set, staring up at nothing, screaming with terror at a creature that existed only in their imagination. That, in itself, is a kind of artistry. To believe so fiercely in what isn't there, to lend your fear or awe to a blank wall, trusting that later, months down the line, an invisible collaborator, the visual effects artist, will add the missing piece. There are also, as always, controversies. Delays in release dates, whispers about ballooning budgets, questions about whether the gamble of blending fairy tale with blockbuster spectacle would pay off. I find these moments fascinating not because they reveal failure, but because they expose the fragility of cinema. We as audiences so often think of films as inevitable, as though they are simply made and then they exist. But behind every release is a mountain of doubt, 100 anxious conversations, sleepless nights spent wondering if a decision was right. In a way, the giants of the story mirrored the giants of production. Vast, unwieldy, intimidating forces that had to be confronted and tamed. One of my favorite anecdotes involves the film's director working closely with the cast to make sure the tone remained consistent. There's a tightrope walk in stories like this. Too much whimsy, and the giants become laughable. Too much horror, and the heart of the fairy tale vanishes. On set, the director was known to remind actors not just of what they were saying, but of the story's rhythm, its heartbeat. Play the truth, he'd reportedly say, not the fantasy. That advice stuck with me, even as someone simply reflecting on the finished film. Play the truth. In life, in art, perhaps that's all we can do. And then there are the smaller, stranger details that delight me. For instance, the sound design for the giant's footsteps was created by smashing massive crates of vegetables in a recording studio. Cabbages crushed under boots, pumpkins split open, carrots snapped. The squelching, booming echoes were later layered to create the sensation of colossal weight. Imagine that. A scene of terror on screen built from the humble crunch of a cabbage. To me, that is cinema in its purest form, taking the mundane and transforming it into the miraculous. Or consider the wardrobe department, where designers had to invent costumes for giants who had no real precedent. What does a creature twice the size of a house wear? Do they sew? Do they scavenge? Do they adorn themselves with the bones of animals? Or do they drape themselves in crude cloth stitched together from human banners? The final designs reflected a messy mix of these questions, creating garments that looked both ancient and improvised. But behind each choice was an artist sitting at a table, sketching, debating, holding scraps of fabric up to the light. I think about those unseen hands often, the quiet creators whose work frames the very image we consume. Another curious fact that always amuses me. Some of the actors reportedly had an informal competition to see who could improvise the most creative insults while playing the giants. Since much of their dialogue would later be processed digitally, there was space for playful invention. In between takes, hulking performers in motion capture suits would call out bizarre, half-improvised taunts, sometimes so funny that the crew had to stop filming because everyone was laughing. A few of these odd lines supposedly made it into the final sound mix, buried deep enough that only the most attentive ear might catch them. The film's release, too, carries its own strange stories. It was delayed more than once, partly to allow for more visual effects work, partly to avoid competition with other blockbusters. By the time it reached audiences, expectations were complicated. Some critics were eager, others skeptical. I find that uncertainty fascinating. To me, it speaks to how fragile cinema is as a cultural artifact. A story might be grand, but its reception depends on timing, mood, cultural appetite. Sometimes, a film released too early is misunderstood, while the same film released a year later might be hailed as genius. Timing, like the planting of a bean, can change everything. And then there's the human element, the friendships formed on set, the inside jokes shared between cast and crew. One story I love involves the actors bonding during the long, exhausting climb sequences. Suspended by wires, dangling against massive artificial vines, they would often spend hours in uncomfortable harnesses. To keep spirits high, they began telling stories, personal tales, jokes, even bits of poetry. One actor reportedly began singing old folk songs mid-climb, his voice echoing through the cavernous set. The others joined in, and soon enough the crew was listening to impromptu concerts while adjusting cameras and lights. It makes me smile to think that amid all the technology, all the artificial vines and digital giants, what kept the production alive was something as simple as human voices singing together. That, to me, is the truest insight into filmmaking. It is always a marriage of the mechanical and the human, the impossible and the ordinary. Behind every towering giant is an actor in a suit. Behind every climactic battle is a weary crew member holding a boom mic. Behind every sweeping shot is a tired artist hunched over a computer. And yet, when it all comes together, the seams vanish and we believe. We see the vine rise. We hear the giant's thunder. We feel the kingdom tremble. That is the miracle of cinema. Not that it hides its artifice, but that it convinces us to surrender to it, even knowing it is artifice. And perhaps that's why I love exploring the production side of films like this. The story we see on screen is only half the tale. The other half lives in the laughter of crew members, the exhaustion of costume designers, the ingenuity of sound engineers crushing vegetables, the actors sweating in heavy armor, the director whispering, "Play the truth." These details, small and large, are like the hidden roots of the beanstalk, unseen but essential. Without them, nothing would rise. When I reflect on these insights and anecdotes, I find myself grateful, not only for the spectacle that dazzles us, but for the invisible hands that made it possible. The fun facts, the accidents, the behind-the-scenes chaos, they remind me that cinema is never just about giants and crowns. It is about people, ordinary and flawed, working together to create something extraordinary. And in that way, the making of the film mirrors the story itself. A group of unlikely companions climbing into the unknown, facing dangers and absurdities, and somehow, against all odds, bringing back a treasure. When I think back on this film, I don't just see the characters or recall the battles. What lingers with me most vividly are the places, the worlds the story unfolds in, the textures of its landscapes, the shadows cast in corners of the frame that make you feel like you've been transported into another realm entirely. Settings, after all, are not simply background in a movie like this. They are characters in their own right, shaping the narrative, pressing on the hearts of those who wander through them, whispering silent cues to us, the viewers. It begins, of course, in the most ordinary of places, a farm, muddy and unremarkable, with its worn fences and tilled earth. I've always been struck by the quiet poetry of this beginning. Before we are thrust into the chaos of giants or kingdoms, we are rooted in the soil of the everyday. The farm is not beautiful in the way that fantasy lands are often beautiful. It is modest, grounded, even a little dreary. And yet it matters deeply, because it frames our protagonist not as someone born of grandeur, but as someone who comes from the same kind of place many of us do, simple, weathered, unadorned. That ordinariness makes the later ascents in a spectacle all the more powerful. I remember when I first watched it, how the camera lingered on the farm fields with a kind of quiet intimacy. The cinematography at this point is almost shy, soft lighting, muted colors, compositions that don't overwhelm. The choices here remind me of literature's opening pages, where an author eases us into the world slowly, laying foundations before building towers. It feels personal, like being welcomed into someone's home rather than dazzled with fireworks. That restraint is deliberate, and it works. When the fantastic finally erupts, it feels like a rupture, something vast and otherworldly tearing through the fabric of the ordinary. And then, of course, comes the beanstalk itself. What a setting, what a creation. Even now, when I think of the film, it is the image of that twisting, impossible ladder that rises in my mind before anything else. The way it shoots upward into the clouds, its leaves glistening like living glass, its tendrils coiling with a sense of menace and wonder. Here the cinematography shifts drastically. The angles tilt upward, dizzying, pulling the eye toward the heavens. The camera itself feels as though it is climbing, struggling to keep pace with the living structure. I've always believed that this beanstalk isn't just a prop or a fantasy object. It is a metaphorical threshold, and the filmmakers understood that. The way it's filmed, with shafts of light breaking through clouds, with shadows lengthening as characters approach it, transforms it from plant to portal. This is where setting becomes symbol. The farm was earthbound, humble, familiar. The beanstalk is the opposite, vertical, aspirational, frightening in its scale. It is the spine of the story, both literally and thematically, connecting two worlds that should never meet. As the climb begins, I remember feeling almost breathless. The camera adopts movements that mimic vertigo, swooping shots that dart past leaves the size of sails, angles that glance down at the dizzying drop below. There's a tactile texture to these sequences. You can almost feel the roughness of the vines, the dampness of the leaves, the wind battering against the climbers. The cinematography makes you complicit in the ascent. You are not watching someone else climb. You're climbing with them. And this is the genius of the setting. It doesn't simply exist, it demands participation. Once above the clouds, we arrive at another world entirely, a kingdom of giants. And here, the filmmakers seem to revel in creating contrasts. If the farm was muted and humble, this world is exaggerated and grotesque. Everything is oversized, distorted, a parody of the human scale. The ground feels rougher, darker, heavier. The architecture is not elegant but crude, constructed of massive stones that look more torn from the earth than carved with purpose. The lighting shifts too. Shadows grow harsher. The sun filtered through a haze that makes the air itself feel oppressive. It fascinates me how setting here mirrors psychology. The world of giants feels like an embodiment of menace, a landscape where every detail conspires to unsettle. The cinematography amplifies this unease. Low angles exaggerate the giant size. Wide shots emphasize the smallness of humans moving among colossal objects. Even the color palette deepens. Greens turn sickly. Browns become almost tar-like. Skies feel perpetually storm-threatened. Watching it, I felt that the very air of this place carried weight, pressing down on anyone foolish enough to wander into it. What I love most about this giant world is how it resists the polished beauty of so many fantasy films. It is not gilded with magic or shimmering with enchantment.